Miss Marple and 7 Murders on Christmas Day. Welcome to Warm Pages, dear listeners. I'm your host, Edward, and I want to begin by saying how truly grateful I am for each of you who chooses to spend your time here. It warms my heart to know that these stories bring comfort and joy to such a wonderful community of listeners. Preparing every mystery takes time and care, but seeing how much you enjoy them makes it all worthwhile. It means the world to me that our little community continues to grow, and I'm delighted that so many of you are part of it. If you haven't already, please consider subscribing. It helps our channel grow and allows us to bring you even more stories to enjoy together. Chapter 1. Crackers and Charades. The frost lay thick upon the grounds of Ashgrove Hall that Christmas morning of 1953, transforming the sprawling estate into a crystalline wonderland that might have graced a Victorian Christmas card. Miss Jane Marple, settling her fur tippet more securely about her shoulders as she alighted from the motor car, paused to admire the ancient elm trees that stood sentinel along the drive, their bare branches etched against the pale December sky like delicate tracery. "How perfectly lovely," she murmured to Lady Bantry, who had kindly offered to convey her to the Christmas luncheon at Ashgrove Hall. One quite forgets, living so quietly in the village, how imposing these old houses can be. Dolly Bantry, resplendent in burgundy velvet and fox fur, linked arms with her dear friend as they approached the imposing Tudor frontage. "Reginald does like to put on a show," she observed with characteristic directness. "Though I must say, Hester has done wonders with the decorations this year. Look at that holly arrangement above the door." Indeed, the great oak door was framed with an elaborate display of holly and ivy, their dark green leaves glistening with frost, red berries bright as drops of blood against the winter morning. Miss Marple's keen eyes, trained by years of village observation, noted the meticulous way the greenery had been wired and twisted into place. Such attention to detail spoke of patient, skillful hands. The door swung open before they could ring, revealing a young woman of perhaps 28, tall and graceful, with dark hair swept back in the fashionable Victory roll style. Her smile was warm and welcoming, though Miss Marple detected a certain tension about her eyes that seemed at odds with the festive occasion. "Lady Bantry, Miss Marple, how wonderful that you could come. I'm Hester Pomeroy, Sir Reginald's niece. Do come in out of this frightful cold." The great hall of Ashgrove was a symphony of Christmas cheer. Garlands of holly and ivy draped the ancient oak beams, while a magnificent fir tree stood in the corner, its branches heavy with glass baubles and tinsel that caught the light from the blazing log fire. The air was rich with the scents of roasting goose, mince pies, and the sharp, clean fragrance of pine. "Hester, my dear," said a portly gentleman emerging from what appeared to be the morning room, "are these our final guests?" "Excellent. We can proceed to the dining room without further delay." This, Miss Marple surmised, must be Sir Reginald Pomeroy himself. He was a man of perhaps 60, with iron grey hair and the bearing of one accustomed to command. His manner was cordial enough, yet she caught something of the autocrat in his sharp blue eyes and the way he gestured for attention rather than asking for it. "Miss Marple," he said, extending a firm handshake, "delighted to meet you at last. Dolly has spoken of you often. I understand you have something of a reputation for, shall we say, solving puzzles?" Before Miss Marple could reply, Hester had deftly intervened. "Uncle Reginald, you mustn't monopolise our guests. There are introductions to be made, and cook will be quite cross if we delay luncheon much longer." The drawing-room beyond held the remainder of the party. A young man with pleasant open features and the unmistakable bearing of a former soldier rose from beside the fire. His dark hair was neatly combed, his Sunday suit well pressed, but clearly not expensive. When Hester moved to his side, the affectionate way she touched his arm told Miss Marple everything she needed to know about their relationship. "This is John Brent," Hester said, a note of pride creeping into her voice. "My fiancé. John was in the army until recently." Mr. Brent's handshake was firm, his smile genuine, though Miss Marple noted the way his eyes sought Sir Reginald's face, as if seeking approval that was not forthcoming. The older man's expression had grown decidedly cooler at the introduction. Near the window stood a woman of middle years, handsome rather than beautiful, dressed in subdued navy blue that suggested mourning not entirely put aside. Her manner was quietly dignified, though her hands betrayed a slight tremor as she set down her sherry glass. "Mrs. Lydia Forrester," Hester explained, "a dear family friend." Mrs. Forrester acknowledged the introduction with a nod that was polite but reserved. Miss Marple, with her instinct for such things, sensed that the designation of family friend might not tell the complete story where Sir Reginald was concerned. The remaining gentleman was fussing with what appeared to be a strand of fairy lights near the mantelpiece. He was a thin, nervous man of perhaps 40, with prematurely greying hair and the precise movements of someone who took great pride in getting details exactly right. "Theo Grant," he called over his shoulder, not pausing in his work. "Terribly sorry, but these wretched bulbs simply will not behave properly. There's nothing worse than Christmas lights that won't illuminate when required." "Theo is our resident stage manager," Hester explained with evident fondness. "He's transformed the whole house into a Christmas wonderland." Dr. Peter Lyle, the local physician, completed the party. He was a man of 50-odd years, with the comfortable, reassuring manner of a country doctor, his weathered hands speaking of countless nights spent attending the sick. He greeted Miss Marple with particular warmth, having heard much of her reputation from various patients in St. Mary Mead. The luncheon itself was a triumph of traditional Christmas fare. The goose was perfectly roasted, the pudding rich with brandy and bright with silver charms, the conversation animated if occasionally strained. Miss Marple noted the way John Brent seemed to choose his words carefully when addressing Sir Reginald, and how the older man's responses carried an undercurrent of disapproval that cast a subtle shadow over what should have been purely festive proceedings. It was during the pudding course that Sir Reginald made his curious announcement. Rising from his chair, he patted his breast pocket with evident satisfaction, his eyes sweeping the table with something that might have been malicious pleasure. "My friends," he said, raising his glass of port, "I have in my possession certain correspondence that will be posted this evening, after evensong. News that will prove beneficial to some and, I venture to say, quite improving to others who have need of such improvement." The silence that followed was profound. John Brent's face had gone very pale, while Hester's fingers tightened on her napkin until the knuckles showed white. Mrs. Forrester stared fixedly at her plate, and even jovial Dr. Lyle seemed momentarily at a loss for words. It was Hester who broke the uncomfortable moment. "How mysterious, Uncle. But surely we shouldn't trouble ourselves with serious matters on Christmas Day. I'd rather hoped we might have some games after luncheon, something festive and amusing." "Games!" exclaimed Theo Grant, his face brightening considerably. "Capital idea. What did you have in mind?" Hester's smile held a quality that Miss Marple found difficult to define. "I was thinking," she said slowly, "of Murder in the Dark. Chapter 2, 6 Harmless Murders." The drawing-room had been transformed into an arena of delicious anticipation. After the remains of Christmas pudding had been cleared away and the coffee served, Hester had taken charge with the efficient manner of one accustomed to organising entertainment. The heavy curtains had been drawn against the early winter dusk, and Theo Grant was busily adjusting the electric lights to create the proper atmosphere for their game. "Now then," Hester announced, producing a pack of well-worn playing cards from the writing desk, "let me explain the rules for those who may be unfamiliar with Murder in the Dark. It's really quite simple and tremendous fun." Miss Marple settled herself in a comfortable chair near the fireplace, her knitting bag at her side. She had played similar games in her youth, though never, she reflected, in quite such an elaborate setting. Her pale blue eyes took in the arrangement of the room with interest. 2 large sofas faced each other across the Persian carpet, with several armchairs clustered near the hearth. The back corridor, she noted, led toward the servants' stairs in the older part of the house. "We shall need exactly as many cards as there are players," Hester continued, shuffling the deck with practised ease. "Among them will be the ace of spades, that designates our murderer, and the king of hearts, which marks our detective. The remaining cards are quite innocent, I'm afraid." She counted the assembled company. 8 of us, perfect. When I deal the cards, you must look at yours secretly. The person who receives the ace of spades becomes the murderer, but must not reveal this fact. Similarly, our detective, the holder of the king of hearts, keeps silent for the moment. Sir Reginald, who had been examining his port glass with evident satisfaction, looked up with interest. And then what occurs? All the lights go out, Hester replied, her eyes sparkling with anticipation. The murderer moves about in the darkness and kills someone by touching them on the shoulder. The victim must then cry out dramatically and fall down dead. When this happens, everyone calls for lights, and our detective must examine the scene and attempt to deduce the murderer's identity. John Brent shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Seems rather a elaborate business for a simple game. Oh, but that's what makes it exciting, Theo interjected, testing a light switch near the door. The drama, the suspense. I've rigged the switches so I can control the stair lighting from here as well. Adds to the atmosphere, don't you think? Dr. Lyle chuckled. Provided no one actually breaks their neck stumbling about in the dark. Nonsense, said Sir Reginald briskly. Perfectly safe if one uses common sense, though I suppose that's rather asking too much of some people. His glance toward John Brent was barely concealed. Miss Marple noticed how Hester's fingers tightened almost imperceptibly on the cards at this remark, though her voice remained cheerfully light. Shall we begin, then? I do think games are so much more amusing when one doesn't overthink them. The first round commenced with considerable excitement. Hester dealt the cards with the fluid movements of one quite familiar with the process, and Miss Marple observed that she invariably cut the deck herself before dealing, laughing that she possessed a professional dealer's luck from countless evenings of bridge. The lights went out, plunging the room into complete darkness save for the faint glow from the fireplace. There was a moment of suspenseful silence, broken by the rustle of movement and suppressed giggles. Then Mrs. Forrester's voice rang out in theatrical anguish. "Oh, I am undone. Murdered most foully." When Theo restored the lights, they found Mrs. Forrester collapsed dramatically across one of the sofas, one hand pressed to her brow in the finest tradition of the stage. Her paper crown from the Christmas crackers sat askew, lending an almost comical note to her demise. "Excellent performance," declared Sir Reginald approvingly. "Now then, detective, who do you suspect?" Young John Brent, revealed as the holder of the King of Hearts, made a great show of examining the scene before pointing an accusing finger at Dr. Lyle. The physician protested his innocence with mock indignation, but Theo Grant was dramatically unmasked as the true culprit, brandishing the ace of spades with evident pride. And so it continued. 6 rounds of murder in the dark, each more elaborate than the last. Theo himself fell victim in the second round, expiring with operatic flourishes at the piano bench. John Brent met his theatrical end sprawled across a footstool, while Dr. Lyle succumbed with convincing medical accuracy near the hearth. Miss Marple found herself oddly fascinated by the patterns that emerged. Each victim, she noted, fell in the main body of the room, never near the back corridor or the shadowed areas beyond the primary seating arrangement. The murderer seemed to prefer targets within the comfortable circle of sofas and chairs, though whether this was by design or mere coincidence she could not say. More intriguing still was Hester's handling of the cards. After each round she gathered them with swift efficiency, always ensuring she performed the shuffle and cut before the next deal. Miss Marple's sharp eyes detected something curious about 2 of the cards. The ace of spades and king of hearts bore tiny imperfections along their top edges, minute scratches or burrs that might escape casual notice, but would be instantly recognisable to practised fingers. "How remarkable," she murmured to Lady Bantry during a brief interlude when Theo was adjusting the fairy lights. "Such an elaborate game, and yet how orderly it all seems." Dolly Bantry glanced round the room with less observant eyes. "Orderly? My dear Jane, it appears quite chaotic to me. All this falling about in the dark and crying out dramatically." But Miss Marple had noticed other details that struck her as noteworthy. The holly arrangements along the back staircase banister showed evidence of careful wire work, Neat, precise twists that spoke of milliner's training or similar expertise. A small length of black thread had somehow become caught in the varnish of the newel post, its presence inexplicable, but somehow significant. Most puzzling of all, the key to the fuse cupboard, normally kept safely locked away, lay openly on a side table as though placed there for convenience. Sir Reginald, meanwhile, had grown increasingly jovial as the evening progressed, though his joviality carried a sharp edge that made Miss Marple think of a cat playing with a mouse. He patted his breast pocket frequently, as though reassuring himself that his mysterious correspondence remained safely in place. "Splendid entertainment, my dear Hester," he declared, after the 6th round had concluded with Lady Bantry's admirably dignified demise near the fireplace, "though I confess I'm rather hoping to take a more active role in the proceedings. One grows weary of being merely a spectator." Hester's smile was brilliant, though something in her eyes reminded Miss Marple of a winter sunlight on ice. Beautiful, but somehow treacherous. "Oh, but uncle, I've saved the best for last. One final round to crown our evening's entertainment." She moved to gather the cards once more, her movements as graceful and practised as a dancer's. "This time, I think we should make it properly dramatic. All lights out. Even the corridor lighting, Theo. Let us have complete darkness for our grand finale." Theo nodded eagerly, his hands already moving toward the switches. Capital idea. Nothing like absolute darkness to heighten the suspense. Sir Reginald rubbed his hands together with evident anticipation. "Now you're talking sense, girl. Let's have some real excitement." As Hester began to shuffle the cards for the 7th and final time, Miss Marple felt an odd chill that had nothing to do with the December weather outside. There was something about this final round that troubled her, though she could not yet put her finger on precisely what it might be. The cards were dealt with the same practised efficiency, and Miss Marple found herself holding a harmless 7 of clubs. Around the room she sensed the familiar tension, as players examined their hands in secret. But this time the atmosphere seemed different somehow, charged with an electricity that went beyond mere playful anticipation. "Everyone ready?" Hester called out, her voice bright with excitement. "Then let the final murder commence." The lights went out, plunging Ashgrove Hall into Stygian darkness. Chapter 3, the 7th round. The darkness that descended upon the drawing-room of Ashgrove Hall was absolute. Miss Marple, accustomed as she was to the gentle twilight of her cottage in St. Mary Mead, had never experienced such complete absence of light. Even the cheerful glow from the fireplace seemed to have been swallowed by the encompassing blackness, as though the very air had become a thick, impenetrable curtain. She remained quite still in her chair, her knitting bag clutched firmly in her lap, listening to the subtle sounds that darkness seemed to amplify. The old house creaked and settled around them with the comfortable sighs of ancient timber. Somewhere in the room she could hear the soft rustle of fabric as someone moved with careful deliberation. "This is rather thrilling," came Lady Bantry's voice from somewhere to her left, though the darkness made it impossible to judge distances accurately. Her words carried a note of nervous excitement that suggested she, like Miss Marple, was finding this final round rather more intense than the previous 6. A floorboard groaned softly near the window, followed by what might have been the whisper of silk against wood. Miss Marple strained her ears, trying to distinguish between the innocent movements of nervous players and something more purposeful. In her experience, darkness revealed as much as it concealed, if one knew how to listen properly. From the direction of the back corridor came a sound she could not immediately identify, a faint scraping, as though something were being dragged across the floor. Then silence again, save for the barely perceptible sound of controlled breathing from multiple sources around the room. "Getting rather exciting, isn't it?" Sir Reginald's voice boomed out from what seemed to be the centre of the room, though again the darkness played tricks with perception. There was something in his tone that suggested he was thoroughly enjoying himself, perhaps more than was entirely appropriate for what was, after all, merely a parlour game. Miss Marple heard footsteps moving with purpose, confident strides that suggested their owner was quite familiar with the layout of the house. These were followed by lighter, more cautious steps, as though someone else were attempting to navigate the obstacles of furniture and carpeting without benefit of sight. "Do be careful, everyone," Hester's voice drifted from somewhere near the card table. "We shouldn't want any actual accidents in our pursuit of fictional murder." The irony of her words was not lost on Miss Marple, who had begun to feel an inexplicable sense of unease about this final round. Something in the quality of the silence seemed different from the previous games, more charged, more deliberately orchestrated. She found herself thinking of the small details she had observed throughout the evening, the precisely wired holly, the misplaced fuse key, those curious scratches on the playing cards. A sudden burst of laughter from the vicinity of the piano made her start slightly. "Steady on," came John Brent's voice, though whether he was addressing himself or someone else was unclear. "Rather like being inside a coal scuttle, isn't it?" "Adds to the authenticity," replied Theo Grant from what sounded like the doorway leading to the back corridor. "Nothing like genuine darkness to stimulate the imagination." Miss Marple could hear Sir Reginald moving again, his footsteps confident and determined. He seemed to be heading toward the back of the room, away from the main seating area where the previous murders had occurred. This struck her as curious, given that all the earlier victims had met their theatrical ends within the comfortable circle of sofas and chairs. "I say," came Dr. Lyle's voice, tinged with mild concern, "this is rather more thorough than our previous attempts, isn't it? Can barely see my hand in front of my face." "All part of the plan," Hester replied, and Miss Marple detected a note of satisfaction in her voice that seemed oddly inappropriate for mere game-playing. "Theo has been most helpful in ensuring we achieve the proper effect." The sound of movement near the back corridor grew more pronounced. Miss Marple could distinguish what seemed to be two sets of footsteps, one heavy and confident, the other lighter and more measured. The heavier steps appeared to be ascending, presumably taking the back staircase that led to the upper floors of the old house. Then came a sound that chilled Miss Marple to the bone. A sharp cry, cut off almost before it had begun, followed immediately by a heavy, sickening thud that echoed through the darkness with horrible finality. This was no theatrical performance, no playful shriek of mock terror. This was the sound of genuine catastrophe. "I say," John Brent's voice rang out, sharp with alarm. "That didn't sound quite right." The silence that followed was profound and terrible. Miss Marple could hear her own heart beating in the darkness, could sense the collective intake of breath from the other players, as the awful realization began to dawn that something had gone dreadfully wrong. "Lights!" Lady Bantry's voice cracked with sudden panic. "For heaven's sake, get the lights on!" There was a fumbling sound near the door, followed by Theo Grant's voice, high and strained. "I'm trying." "The switch isn't responding properly." More fumbling, the click of switches being thrown repeatedly, then finally blessed illumination as the electric lights blazed back to life. Miss Marple blinked against the sudden brightness, her eyes adjusting quickly to take in the scene before her. The drawing room appeared much as they had left it, with one crucial exception. Sir Reginald Pomeroy was nowhere to be seen, though his absence was explained by the terrible sounds they had heard from the back corridor. "Where is he?" Mrs. Forrester whispered, her face pale as parchment. Dr. Lyle was already moving toward the back corridor, his medical training overriding any hesitation. Miss Marple followed, though her elderly legs prevented her from matching his pace. Behind them came the others, their footsteps uncertain, their voices hushed with apprehension. At the foot of the back staircase they found Sir Reginald Pomeroy. He lay crumpled against the stone floor of the corridor, his body twisted at an angle that spoke eloquently of the violence of his fall. His head rested against the ancient flagstones in a spreading pool of crimson that caught the light from the overhead fixture with horrible clarity. Dr. Lyle knelt beside the fallen man, his practiced hands moving with professional efficiency. After what seemed an eternity, but was probably no more than a few moments, he looked up with a grave expression that told them everything they needed to know. "I'm afraid he's dead," he said quietly. "His skull has been fractured against the stone. The fall must have been considerable." "Fall?" Hester's voice was barely above a whisper. "But how?" Why would he have been on the stairs in the darkness? Miss Marple's attention was drawn to the banister of the back staircase. The holly arrangement that had been so carefully wired in place was now disturbed, several sprigs hanging at odd angles. One piece lay on the floor near Sir Reginald's body, its wire binding twisted and broken. "We must telephone for the police immediately," Dr. Lyle said, rising to his feet with evident difficulty. His face had gone quite grey with shock. "This is a matter for Inspector Slack." As if summoned by the mention of authority, the sound of a motor car could be heard approaching the house. Within minutes, Inspector Slack himself was striding through the front door, his expression grim and businesslike. Miss Marple was not entirely surprised to see him. Christmas Day or not, tragic accidents had a way of requiring official attention. "Well then," the inspector said after a brief examination of the scene, "appears straightforward enough. Gentleman was playing some fool game in the dark, misjudged the stairs, took a tumble. Bound to happen, carrying on like that at his age." But Miss Marple, studying the disturbed holly and remembering the careful precision with which it had been arranged, was not so certain that this was merely a tragic accident. "Inspector," she said quietly, "might I suggest a rather more thorough examination of the circumstances?" Inspector Slack looked at her with the weary expression of a man who had encountered Miss Marple's suggestions before. "What exactly are you thinking, Miss Marple?" She gazed up at the banister, at the empty twist of wire where Holly had been so carefully secured. "I'm thinking, Inspector, that games can be very dangerous indeed when someone brings real intentions to them." Chapter 4. Black Thread on the Newel. The drawing-room had taken on the hush quality that always seemed to settle over houses where death had made an unwelcome visit. Inspector Slack had requested that the party remain together while he conducted his initial examination, and they sat in uncomfortable silence, the festive decorations now seeming almost mocking in their cheerful abundance. Miss Marple occupied herself with her knitting, the steady click of her needles providing a soothing counterpoint to the subdued conversations taking place around her. Her pale blue eyes, however, were far from idle. She observed the way Hester Pomeroy sat rigidly upright in her chair, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that the knuckles showed white against her dark dress. John Brent hovered protectively near his fiancée, though his own face bore the strained expression of a man grappling with shock and something that might have been relief. "Dreadful business," murmured Dr. Lyle for perhaps the third time, mopping his brow with a handkerchief, despite the December chill that seemed to have penetrated the room. Poor Reginald. To think that a simple game could end so tragically. Mrs. Forrester had withdrawn into herself, her earlier theatrical demeanour replaced by a sombre dignity that spoke of genuine grief, or perhaps something more complex. Theo Grant fidgeted continuously with his spectacles, polishing them with obsessive attention, as though he could somehow clarify the terrible events of the past hour. Lady Bantry moved to sit beside Miss Marple, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Jane, dear, you don't truly believe this was merely an accident, do you? I saw your expression when you examined that banister." Before Miss Marple could reply, Inspector Slack reappeared from the back corridor, his notebook clutched in one meaty hand. His expression suggested a man who preferred his cases to be straightforward and was mildly irritated to find complications arising. "Well then," he announced to the assembled company, "seems clear enough what occurred. Sir Reginald, caught up in the excitement of your game, took the back stairs in complete darkness, misjudged his footing, took a tumble, struck his head on the stone floor. Tragic, but hardly mysterious." "If I might venture a question, Inspector," Miss Marple said gently, setting aside her knitting with deliberate care. "Has anyone examined the staircase itself with particular attention?" Inspector Slack's expression suggested he was not entirely pleased by this interruption. "Examined it? Of course I've examined it, Miss Marple. Stone steps, wooden banister, holly decorations, nothing out of the ordinary except for a bit of disturbance where the deceased fell against the greenery." "Ah yes, the holly arrangements," Miss Marple murmured. "Might we take a closer look at those?" "With proper lighting, of course. I find that details often reveal themselves more clearly under careful scrutiny." With evident reluctance, Inspector Slack led the way back to the scene of the tragedy. Dr. Lyle had covered Sir Reginald's body with a tablecloth from the dining room, lending the scene a dignity that the violent circumstances of death had temporarily stolen. Miss Marple approached the foot of the staircase with the measured steps of one who understood the importance of observation. Lady Bantry, ever faithful, followed close behind, though she held her handkerchief ready and kept her gaze carefully averted from the covered form on the flagstones. "Now then," Miss Marple said, producing a small magnifying glass from her reticule, "let us see what the banister might tell us." She began her examination at the bottom of the staircase, working her way methodically upward. The holly had indeed been disturbed. Several sprigs hung at unnatural angles, their glossy leaves dulled with dust and their red berries scattered across the stone floor. But it was at the newel post, where the banister began its ascent, that she paused with particular interest. "Inspector, might I trouble you for a candle? The electric light, though adequate for general purposes, can sometimes cast shadows that obscure important details." With obvious impatience, Inspector Slack procured a candle from the drawing-room mantelpiece. Miss Marple held it close to the newel post, adjusting the angle of illumination with the precision of an artist studying a canvas. "Most interesting," she murmured, extending her hand toward the varnished wood. Between her thumb and forefinger, she captured several thin strands of what appeared to be black thread, so fine as to be nearly invisible, yet unmistakably present in the shallow groove where the varnish had settled over the years. "What's that you've found?" Inspector Slack demanded, leaning closer with newfound attention. "Black sewing silk, I believe," Miss Marple replied, examining the strands in the candlelight. "Very fine quality, the sort used for delicate work. See how the ends have been snapped rather than cut. That suggests they were pulled taut and then broken under sudden stress." She moved to the top of the staircase, her examination becoming even more meticulous. The uppermost step showed a curious mark, a faint scuff in the old wood polish, positioned at precisely ankle height. It was barely visible, no more than a thin line across the worn timber, but its placement struck Miss Marple as remarkably deliberate. "Dolly dear," she called softly, "might you bring the candle a bit closer? Yes, just there. Now then, observe this marking. See how it runs straight across the step, as though something had been drawn taut at this exact height." Lady Bantry peered over Miss Marple's shoulder, though her expression suggested she was not entirely certain what she was meant to be observing. "I'm afraid I don't quite see." "A line, my dear. Someone stretched a line across this step, positioned at the precise height to catch an unsuspecting ankle. The black silk threads caught in the newel post varnish are the remnants, pulled free when the line snapped under the weight of Sir Reginald's fall." Inspector Slack's scepticism was evident in his voice. "You're suggesting someone deliberately set a trap? But why would anyone want to harm Sir Reginald? And how could they have known he would take the back stairs during the game?" Miss Marple's attention had moved to the holly arrangement directly above the marked step. Here, the careful wirework that had so impressed her earlier in the evening showed signs of recent disturbance. One sprig hung at an odd angle, its supporting wire cut cleanly through, leaving only a small twist of metal still attached to the banister rail. "Inspector," she said thoughtfully, "you mentioned that this appeared to be a tragic accident during a harmless game. But consider the evidence before us. The black silk positioned precisely to trip someone ascending these stairs. The holly wire that has been cut, not torn or pulled loose, but cut with a sharp implement. The careful timing that ensured complete darkness during the crucial moment." "Are you saying," Lady Bantry whispered, her voice hardly above a breath, "that someone deliberately murdered Sir Reginald during the game?" Before Miss Marple could respond, footsteps echoed from the direction of the drawing-room. Hester Pomeroy appeared in the corridor doorway, her face pale but composed. "Inspector, might I ask how much longer we shall be required to remain? The shock of Uncle Reginald's death has been quite overwhelming, and I fear several of our guests are feeling rather unwell." Miss Marple observed the young woman with renewed interest. Hester's composure was admirable under the circumstances, yet there was something in the way she avoided looking directly at the staircase that suggested a reluctance to confront the scene of the tragedy. "Just a few more minutes, miss," Inspector Slack replied. "Miss Marple seems to think there might be more to this business than meets the eye." Hester's gaze flickered briefly to Miss Marple, and in that moment the elderly lady caught something that confirmed her growing suspicions. Fear, carefully controlled but unmistakable, lurked behind the young woman's steady brown eyes. "Of course," Hester said quietly, "we must naturally cooperate fully with your investigation. Though I confess I cannot imagine what more there could be to discover about such a tragic accident." Miss Marple folded the black silk threads carefully in her handkerchief, her mind already beginning to piece together the intricate puzzle that was taking shape before her. Games, she reflected, could indeed be dangerous when someone brought deadly serious intentions to what should have been harmless entertainment. "Inspector," she said with quiet authority, "I believe we shall need to examine several other matters with considerable care. This was no accident, and the murderer is still among us." Chapter 5. The Fuse with Silver Foil. The revelation that Sir Reginald's death might not have been accidental cast a pall over the assembled company that went far beyond the natural grief occasioned by sudden tragedy. Inspector Slack, his earlier confidence in a simple explanation now somewhat shaken, found himself regarding each member of the Christmas party with the suspicious eye of a man who had learned not to take appearances at face value. Miss Marple, meanwhile, had returned her attention to what might have seemed like minor details, but which her long experience had taught her were often the most significant clues of all. The matter of the lighting during that final fatal round of murder in the dark particularly occupied her thoughts. "Mr. Grant," she said gently, approaching Theo where he sat hunched in a corner chair, still polishing his spectacles with nervous energy. "You mentioned earlier that you had arranged to control not only the drawing-room lights, but also the stair lighting from your position near the door. Might I ask you to explain exactly how this was accomplished?" Theo looked up with the startled expression of a rabbit caught in a motor car's headlamps. "Oh, well, it's really quite simple. The main switch controls the drawing-room fixtures, and I had the electrician install a secondary switch that governs the back corridor and staircase. Thought it would add to the dramatic effect, you understand." "Most ingenious," Miss Marple observed. "And during the 7th round you activated both switches?" "Certainly, complete darkness, just as Miss Pomeroy requested, though I must say, it seemed rather more thorough than our previous attempts. Usually there's some residual glow from the fire or the corridor, but this time everything went absolutely black." Inspector Slack frowned. "Are you saying the lights should have come back on when you threw the switches again?" "Well, yes, that's just the peculiar thing," Theo replied, his nervousness increasing. "When we heard that dreadful cry and I tried to restore the lights, the drawing-room illumination returned immediately, but the stair lighting remained dark. I had to try the switch several times before it finally responded." Miss Marple exchanged a meaningful glance with Lady Bantry. Most curious indeed. "Inspector, might we examine the electrical arrangements? I have a feeling they may prove quite illuminating, if you'll pardon the expression." The fuse cupboard was located in a small alcove near the servants' entrance, its wooden door bearing the brass nameplate that proclaimed it the domain of electrical services. Inspector Slack produced his torch, though Miss Marple noted that the cupboard key, which logic suggested should have been safely locked away, lay openly on a nearby shelf. "Rather convenient that the key was so readily accessible," she murmured, more to herself than to the inspector. The interior of the cupboard revealed the neat array of porcelain fuse holders that governed the house's electrical supply. Inspector Slack played his torch beam across them systematically, and it was Miss Marple who first noticed the irregularity. "Inspector, might you direct your light to that fuse, 3rd from the left? The one that controls the stair circuit, I believe." What they discovered proved most enlightening indeed. The fuse cartridge that should have contained the proper electrical component had been bridged with a small twist of silver foil, unmistakably the wrapper from a chocolate sweet, folded with neat precision and positioned so that the circuit would remain interrupted regardless of the switch position. "Extraordinary," Inspector Slack muttered, carefully extracting the makeshift bridge with his handkerchief. Someone deliberately sabotaged the lighting to ensure the back stairs remained dark. Miss Marple examined the silver foil with interest. It bore the distinctive embossed pattern of expensive confectionery, the sort that might be found in a box of Christmas chocolates. More significantly, one edge showed a faint smudge of what appeared to be chocolate, suggesting it had been removed from an actual sweet rather than prepared in advance. "Inspector, you may recall that chocolates were passed round just before the final game commenced. Most thoughtful hospitality, though it now appears to have served a dual purpose." They returned to the drawing room to find the party in a state of barely controlled anxiety. Hester Pomeroy sat with her hands folded in her lap, though Miss Marple noticed a telltale smear of silver on the fingertip of her right glove, so faint as to be nearly invisible, but present nonetheless for those who knew where to look. "Miss Pomeroy," Inspector Slack said with newfound authority, "might I ask about the chocolates that were distributed before the final round of your game?" Hester's composure remained admirable, though a careful observer might have detected the slightest tightening around her eyes. "Chocolates, Inspector? Oh yes. I had some left over from our Christmas crackers. I thought it would be pleasant to share them before our last game." "And where are the remainder of these chocolates now?" "I believe the box is on the side table near the fuse cupboard key." The words were spoken with casual indifference, yet Miss Marple caught the slight emphasis on the word key that suggested Hester was quite aware of the significance of its placement. Dr. Lyle, who had been unusually quiet since the discovery of the body, cleared his throat nervously. "I say, Inspector, surely you're not suggesting that someone planned this tragedy in advance? The very idea seems preposterous." "Does it, Dr. Lyle?" Miss Marple asked mildly. "Consider the evidence we have gathered." The trip line positioned precisely where it would cause maximum harm. The electrical circuit deliberately sabotaged to ensure prolonged darkness. The careful timing that guaranteed Sir Reginald would be ascending those stairs at the crucial moment. John Brent had grown increasingly pale during this recitation, but how could anyone have known that Sir Reginald would take the back stairs during the game? The previous rounds had all taken place in the drawing room proper. It was an excellent question, and Miss Marple regarded the young man with approval. "A very astute observation, Mr. Brent. Indeed, how could the murderer have been certain of directing Sir Reginald to that particular location? Unless, of course, they had some means of ensuring he would be drawn there." She moved to the card table where the playing cards still lay scattered from their interrupted game. Under the direct light of the table lamp, she began to examine each card with the methodical attention of a scholar studying ancient manuscripts. "Most interesting," she murmured after several minutes of careful scrutiny. "Inspector, might you observe these two cards in particular? The Ace of Spades and the King of Hearts." Under the magnifying glass, both cards revealed tiny scratches along their top edges, so minute as to escape casual notice, yet perfectly positioned to be detected by sensitive fingertips during the dealing process. "Someone has marked these cards," Inspector Slack observed with growing excitement. "They could be placed exactly where the dealer intended." "Precisely," Miss Marple agreed. "And if we consider the pattern of the 7th round, we find that Mr. Brent drew the King of Hearts, making him the detective, while Sir Reginald, as was his habit when not selected for a special role, naturally assumed he might be the murderer and took his preferred route toward the back of the house." The implications were becoming clear to everyone present. Someone had orchestrated not merely a game, but a carefully planned execution, using the innocent entertainment as cover for premeditated murder. "The question that remains," Miss Marple said quietly, "is who possessed both the opportunity and the knowledge necessary to arrange such an elaborate deception?" Her gaze moved thoughtfully around the room, taking in each face with the penetrating attention that had solved so many mysteries in her long career. The murderer was here among them. She was certain of that. The challenge now lay in proving which of these seemingly innocent Christmas guests had planned and executed such a coldly calculated crime. Chapter 6. The Ace with a Scratch. The atmosphere in the drawing room had grown considerably more strained as the full implications of Miss Marple's discoveries became apparent to the assembled company. What had begun as a tragic accident was now revealed as something far more sinister, a carefully orchestrated murder disguised as harmless entertainment. Inspector Slack had assumed the commanding presence that came naturally to him when confronted with criminal activity. His notebook was filled with observations, and his sharp eyes moved from face to face with the calculating gaze of a man assembling the pieces of a complex puzzle. "Now then," he announced with official gravity, "it's clear we're dealing with premeditated murder. Someone in this room planned and executed Sir Reginald's death with considerable forethought. The question is who?" Miss Marple had settled herself in the billiard room, which adjoined the main drawing room, and afforded both privacy for her investigations and a convenient vantage point from which to observe the suspects. The playing cards lay spread before her on the green baize surface of the billiard table, illuminated by the steady glow of an electric lamp that cast no deceptive shadows. Lady Bantry joined her, settling into a nearby chair with evident relief to be away from the increasingly oppressive atmosphere of the drawing room. "Jane, dear, this is all becoming rather frightful. To think that one of our fellow guests could have planned such a thing." "Indeed, Dolly. Yet when one examines the evidence systematically, certain patterns emerge that tell a most revealing story." Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles and returned her attention to the cards. Under the magnifying glass, the tiny scratches on the Ace of Spades and King of Hearts were unmistakable, deliberate marks made by someone who understood that experienced fingers could detect such minute alterations during the dealing process. "Consider the mechanics of the crime," she continued, her voice taking on the measured tone she employed when working through a particularly complex problem. "Our murderer needed to ensure that Sir Reginald would be in a specific location at a precise moment. This required not only opportunity, but also considerable knowledge of his habits and preferences. Through the doorway they could observe the remaining members of the Christmas party. Hester Pomeroy sat with admirable composure, her hands folded neatly in her lap, though Miss Marple noted the way her eyes avoided the scattered playing cards on the drawing-room table. John Brent hovered near his fiancée with protective concern, while Dr. Lyle maintained the professional demeanour of a man accustomed to dealing with crisis situations. "The marked cards tell us several important things," Miss Marple observed, carefully examining the Ace of Spades once more. "First, that the murderer possessed both the means and the knowledge to mark them so subtly. Second, that they had intimate familiarity with the game's mechanics and could predict how the various players would respond to their assigned roles." Mrs. Forrester had withdrawn to the window seat, her grief-stricken expression suggesting genuine sorrow at Sir Reginald's death. Theo Grant continued his nervous fidgeting, adjusting his spectacles and smoothing his hair with the restless energy of someone deeply unsettled by the evening's events. "But surely," Lady Bantry whispered, "anyone could have marked those cards. I mean, it wouldn't require any special skill, would it?" Miss Marple smiled gently at her friend's practical approach to the problem. "Ah, but consider the precision required, my dear. The marks had to be subtle enough to escape detection by 7 other players, yet distinctive enough for the dealer to identify by touch during the shuffling and cutting process. This suggests someone with considerable dexterity and experience in handling cards." She moved to the doorway, observing the drawing room with fresh eyes. The card table where Hester had conducted each round of dealing was positioned to provide clear sight lines to every corner of the room. More significantly, it offered an unobstructed view of the back corridor where Sir Reginald had met his death. The dealer's position was crucial to the success of the plan, Miss Marple continued her analysis. Not only did it allow for the controlled distribution of the marked cards, but it provided perfect observation of the players' movements during each round. Inspector Slack approached with evident impatience. "Miss Marple, while your examination of the cards is thorough, we need to focus on identifying our murderer. The evidence is compelling, but we require proof of who actually committed this crime." "Quite right, Inspector. Let us consider what we know about each person's actions during the crucial 7th round. Miss Marple returned to the billiard table and began arranging the cards in systematic order. Mr. Brent drew the King of Hearts, making him the detective. This required him to position himself away from the main action, traditionally near the front entrance to investigate once a murder occurred. John Brent nodded grimly from his position near Hester. That's correct. I moved toward the front hall as soon as the lights went out, exactly as I had in previous rounds when I was the detective. Sir Reginald, finding himself without a special role, naturally assumed he might be selected as the murderer and took his customary route toward the back of the house. This was entirely predictable behaviour based on the pattern established in earlier rounds. Dr. Lyle cleared his throat. I remained near the fireplace, as did most of us. The backstairs area was quite empty except for Sir Reginald. Precisely, Miss Marple agreed, which brings us to the critical question. Who had both the opportunity to sabotage the electrical fuse and the knowledge of card manipulation necessary to orchestrate this elaborate scheme? She moved to examine the fuse cupboard key once more, noting its convenient placement on the side table. The timing required for this crime was extraordinary. The fuse had to be bridged after the 6th round, but before the 7th. The trip line needed to be set during the brief interval when attention was focused on distributing chocolates and preparing for the final game. Theo Grant looked up nervously. But surely any of us could have accessed the fuse cupboard. The key was readily available. True, Mr. Grant, but consider the precision required. The chocolate foil had to be folded exactly right to bridge the circuit properly. Too loose, and it wouldn't maintain contact. Too tight, and it might have blown the main electrical system. This suggests someone with practical knowledge of such matters. Miss Marple's gaze moved thoughtfully around the room, taking in each suspect with careful attention. The murderer had demonstrated considerable technical skill, intimate knowledge of the house's layout, and remarkable insight into human psychology. There is one more crucial element, she observed quietly. The person who committed this crime had to possess detailed knowledge of Sir Reginald's habits and preferences. They needed to predict not only his movements during the game, but his likely reactions to specific situations. The weight of her words settled over the company like a shroud. Someone among them had studied Sir Reginald Pomeroy with deadly intent, learning his patterns and exploiting his predictable responses to orchestrate his murder with chilling efficiency. The question that remains, Miss Marple concluded, is which of you possessed all these qualifications, and, more importantly, what motive could have driven someone to such elaborate and calculated revenge? Chapter 7, Holly Wire and a Snip. The investigation had reached that delicate stage where theories begin to crystallize into certainties, and Miss Marple found herself drawn once again to the physical evidence that would ultimately provide the key to unlocking this carefully constructed puzzle. The holly arrangements, which had seemed merely decorative that morning, now held secrets that could expose a murderer. Inspector Slack had become increasingly methodical in his approach, a transformation that Miss Marple viewed with quiet approval. He stood now at the foot of the back staircase, examining the disturbed greenery with the focused attention of a man who had learned to respect the significance of seemingly trivial details. "Miss Marple," he called, "you mentioned earlier that one of these holly sprigs showed signs of having been cut rather than torn. Might you point out the specific evidence?" Miss Marple approached with careful steps, her magnifying glass at the ready. The banister's Christmas decoration, which had appeared so festive and welcoming earlier in the day, now told a story of deliberate sabotage. She directed the inspector's attention to a sprig near the uppermost newel post, where the holly's natural binding had been severed with surgical precision. "Observe the cut end of this wire, Inspector. See how clean the separation is. This was not damaged accidentally during Sir Reginald's fall. Someone used a sharp instrument, scissors most likely, to cut through the binding at exactly the right moment. The severed wire had left behind a small stub, perhaps 2 inches in length, still twisted around the banister rail. But it was what Miss Marple discovered next that provided the most damning evidence yet. In the gilt match trough that sat upon a small table near the staircase entrance, partially concealed beneath a collection of spent matches, lay the missing piece of holly wire. What made this discovery particularly significant was the tiny strand of black silk that remained attached to one end, twisted with the same neat precision that characterized all the evening's murderous preparations. "Extraordinary attention to detail," Inspector Slack murmured, carefully extracting the wire with his handkerchief. "Our murderer thought to dispose of the evidence, but failed to account for this small remnant." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "Indeed, Inspector. And notice how the silk has been snipped rather than broken. The cut is clean and precise, suggesting the use of small, sharp scissors designed for delicate work." This observation prompted a thorough search of the drawing room, with particular attention paid to the personal belongings of their suspects. It was Lady Bantry who made the crucial discovery, her sharp eyes catching the glint of metal within Hester Pomeroy's elegant beaded reticule. "I say, Miss Pomeroy," Lady Bantry called, with the forthright manner that had always characterized her approach to uncomfortable situations. "What charming little scissors you have here. Are they antique?" Hester's composure, which had remained admirably steady throughout the evening's increasingly uncomfortable revelations, showed the first signs of genuine strain. Her voice carried a slight tremor as she replied, "They belong to my grandmother. I keep them for small tasks, cutting ribbon from Christmas crackers and such." Inspector Slack examined the tiny scissors with considerable interest. They were beautifully crafted, with silver blades no longer than 2 inches, and handles decorated with mother-of-pearl inlay. More significantly, a microscopic examination revealed traces of both black silk and copper wire caught between the blades, evidence that would be difficult to explain away as coincidental. "Miss Pomeroy," the inspector said with newfound gravity, "these scissors appear to have been used recently for cutting both silk thread and wire. Might you explain how such materials came to be on the blades?" The young woman's laugh had a brittle quality that suggested nerves stretched nearly to the breaking point. "How curious that you should ask. I did help with the holly arrangements this morning. Uncle Reginald was quite particular about having everything properly secured. As for silk thread, I did some mending earlier in the day. Surely there's nothing suspicious about either activity." Miss Marple had been watching this exchange with the keen attention of a naturalist observing specimens under a microscope. Hester's explanations were plausible individually, yet taken together they painted a picture of someone who had possessed both the tools and the opportunity to commit murder. The morning's decorating activities would indeed explain the wire traces, she observed gently. However, the combination of black silk and holly wire, found together with such precision, suggests rather more recent usage than general household tasks would account for. Dr. Lyle, who had maintained an increasingly uncomfortable silence as the evidence mounted, finally spoke up. "I say, this is all becoming rather absurd. Surely we're not seriously suggesting that Miss Pomeroy murdered her own uncle over some trifling domestic disagreement." It was John Brent who provided the answer that had been lurking beneath the surface of the evening's events. His face had grown progressively paler as the investigation proceeded, and now he seemed to have reached a decision that cost him considerable effort. "It wasn't a trifling disagreement," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Sir Reginald had made his intentions quite clear regarding our engagement. He intended to prevent our marriage by any means necessary." Hester turned toward her fiancé with an expression of alarm. "John, please, there's no need to—" "Yes, there is," he interrupted with sudden firmness. "Inspector, you should know that Sir Reginald had threatened to revive certain military matters from my past, incidents that could have destroyed any hope I had of civilian employment. He had considerable influence with government officials." Miss Marple absorbed this revelation with the satisfaction of someone whose theories were being confirmed by facts. "The letter in Sir Reginald's pocket, I presume? The correspondence he mentioned posting after evensong?" Inspector Slack nodded grimly. "We found it during our examination of the body. 2 documents, actually. One withdrawing consent for the engagement, and another intended for the Home Office regarding Mr. Brent's military service." The motive had finally emerged from the shadows where it had lurked all evening. Sir Reginald Pomeroy, in his determination to control his niece's future and maintain his position of authority, had signed his own death warrant through the very cruelty that had driven someone to murderous desperation. Yet even with motive established and physical evidence mounting, Miss Marple recognised that one crucial element remained unresolved. The crime had required not merely opportunity and means, but also the specific skills and knowledge that would enable someone to execute such an elaborate plan successfully. The holly arrangements this morning, she mused aloud, were they entirely Miss Pomeroy's work, or did others assist with the decorating? Theo Grant looked up nervously. Oh, I helped a bit with the higher reaches, but Miss Pomeroy did most of the detailed work herself. Quite artistic, really. She has a wonderful touch with such things. Indeed, Miss Marple murmured. The sort of skill one might expect from someone with millinery training, perhaps. The precision of the wirework suggested professional expertise. For the first time all evening, Hester Pomeroy's carefully maintained facade cracked completely. Her face went white as parchment, and her hands began to tremble visibly. "I don't know what you're suggesting," she whispered. "I never worked as a milliner." But Miss Marple had seen that particular quality of wirework before, in the shop windows of Bond Street, and the careful constructions of women who earned their living, creating beautiful things with patient, skillful hands. Chapter 8. Boot dust on the wrong step. The evidence was mounting with the inexorable weight of mathematical proof, yet Miss Marple knew that Inspector Slack would require more than circumstantial details to make an arrest that would satisfy the requirements of law. The physical traces they had uncovered told a compelling story, but the final piece of the puzzle lay in understanding exactly how the murderer had positioned the fatal trap with such deadly precision. It was Dr. Lyle who inadvertently provided the next crucial observation. As the physician knelt beside the covered form of Sir Reginald Pomeroy to make his final examination, before the body was removed, he called out with puzzlement evident in his voice, "Inspector, there's something rather odd about the deceased's boots. The right one shows traces of white dust, while the left appears quite clean. Most peculiar, considering both feet would have encountered the same surfaces during his fall." Miss Marple approached with renewed interest, her keen eyes focusing on this latest detail. The boot in question bore distinct traces of chalky white powder, concentrated on the toe area, as though Sir Reginald had kicked against something coated with the substance just before his fatal tumble. "Chalk dust, I believe," she observed after careful examination. "But where in this house would one encounter such material? The floors are all stone or polished wood, neither of which would produce such residue." Lady Bantry, ever helpful in her practical way, provided the answer. "Oh, that would be from the nursery upstairs. The children were here earlier in the week and marked out a hopscotch court with chalk on the old schoolroom floor. Frightful mess, but they did so enjoy themselves." Inspector Slack frowned deeply. "But the nursery is 2 floors above this location. How would chalk from there come to be on Sir Reginald's boot if he fell here on the back stairs?" This question prompted a thorough examination of the staircase itself, with particular attention paid to the uppermost step where Miss Marple had earlier discovered the scuff mark indicating the trip line's position. What they found provided the most damning evidence yet of the murderer's meticulous preparation. The top step's riser, the vertical surface that faced upward, bore faint traces of the same chalky white residue. However, the horizontal treads both above and below showed no such marking, suggesting that the chalk had been deliberately applied to this specific location for a particular purpose. "Most ingenious," Miss Marple murmured, kneeling carefully to examine the evidence. The murderer used chalk to mark the precise height for positioning the trip line. By dusting the riser at ankle level, they could ensure the silk thread would be stretched at exactly the right elevation to catch an unsuspecting foot. The methodical nature of the crime's preparation was becoming increasingly apparent. Someone had studied the staircase with an engineer's precision, calculating angles and measurements to guarantee the fatal outcome. After the trap had served its purpose, the chalk markings on the treads had been carefully wiped away, though the telltale residue on the riser had been overlooked in the darkness. Inspector Slack nodded grimly. "So our murderer went up to the nursery, obtained chalk, marked the step for positioning the trip line, then cleaned away the evidence afterward. This shows extraordinary premeditation. Indeed, Miss Marple agreed, but there's another element that troubles me considerably. Dr. Lyle, you mentioned that Sir Reginald's spectacles were found in his breast pocket rather than on his nose. This seems most unusual for a gentleman who habitually wore them for close work or navigation in dim light. Dr. Lyle looked uncomfortable under this scrutiny. Yes, that did strike me as odd. Sir Reginald was quite particular about wearing his glasses when using the stairs, particularly in reduced lighting. He once told me that his depth perception wasn't what it used to be. This revelation cast new light on the crime's methodology. Sir Reginald, a cautious man by nature, would normally have taken care to put on his spectacles before attempting the back stairs in darkness. That he had not done so suggested he had been provoked into hasty movement, perhaps by some urgent sound or call that demanded immediate investigation. Someone deliberately lured him to the stairs, Miss Marple concluded quietly. He was encouraged to move quickly, without taking his usual precautions. The murderer understood his character well enough to manipulate his responses with deadly efficiency. The psychological portrait of the crime was becoming as clear as the physical evidence. This was not a crime of passion or sudden opportunity, but a carefully orchestrated execution that had exploited every aspect of Sir Reginald's personality and habits. Hester Pomeroy had grown increasingly silent as these revelations mounted. She sat rigidly upright in her chair, her hands clasped so tightly that the knuckles showed white against her gloves. John Brent stood beside her with the protective stance of a man watching his world crumble around him. The chalk traces tell us something else of considerable importance, Miss Marple continued her analysis. Whoever applied them had to know the exact layout of the house, including the location of the nursery and the children's recent activities. This suggests intimate familiarity with Ashgrove Hall and its routines. Mrs. Forrester stirred in her corner chair, her voice carrying a note of distress. Surely you're not suggesting that one of the family could have— She broke off, unable to complete the terrible thought. I'm suggesting, Miss Marple replied gently, that murder most often occurs within the circle of those who know their victim best. Strangers rarely possess the detailed knowledge of habits and weaknesses that this crime required. Theo Grant had been fidgeting increasingly throughout these revelations, his nervous energy manifesting in the constant adjustment of his spectacles and the smoothing of his hair. Finally, he could contain himself no longer. This is all becoming rather nightmarish, he burst out. To think that someone we know, someone we've spent Christmas Day with, could have planned such a terrible thing. It's like something from a sensation novel. Life, I'm afraid, sometimes proves more dramatic than fiction, Miss Marple observed. The human heart is capable of both great love and great hatred, often existing side by side in the same person. The room had grown oppressively silent, the weight of accumulated evidence creating an atmosphere thick with unspoken accusations. Everyone present understood that they were witnessing the final moments before a murderer would be unmasked. Yet no one seemed eager to reach that inevitable conclusion. Inspector Slack cleared his throat with official authority. Based on the evidence we've gathered, the marked cards, the sabotaged fuse, the tripline materials, and now the chalk markings, it's clear we're dealing with someone who possessed both detailed knowledge of this house and considerable technical skill. Miss Marple nodded slowly. Indeed, Inspector. Someone who combined the patience of a craftsperson with the ruthlessness of an executioner. The question that remains is whether our murderer will confess to their crime or force us to present our case piece by piece. Chapter 9, The Letter by the Bell, the sealed envelope that Inspector Slack had discovered in Sir Reginald Pomeroy's breast pocket, proved to be the final key that unlocked the mystery of motive, transforming what had been a puzzle of method into a complete understanding of murderous intent. The contents, when revealed, cast a harsh light on the domestic tensions that had simmered beneath the surface of what should have been a joyous Christmas celebration. Miss Marple examined the envelope with her customary attention to detail before Inspector Slack broke the wax seal. The address was written in Sir Reginald's bold, authoritative hand, directed to the Postal Service for collection after evensong, a detail that provided a grim chronology to his final hours. "Note the quality of the seal, Inspector," she observed quietly. "It has been opened and resealed, though with considerable care. The original wax shows a hairline crack, and there are traces of household sealing wax over the original impression. Someone examined these contents before Sir Reginald's death. The first document was precisely what John Brent had feared, a formal withdrawal of consent for his engagement to Hester Pomeroy. Sir Reginald's language was coldly legal and utterly final, citing concerns regarding the moral character and financial prospects of the intended bridegroom as grounds for his decision. But it was the second document that revealed the true vindictiveness behind Sir Reginald's actions. Addressed to the Home Office, it contained a detailed account of John Brent's court-martial proceedings in Italy, along with Sir Reginald's recommendation that the young man be barred from any position requiring security clearance or public trust. "Devastating," Dr. Lyle murmured after reading the documents over Inspector Slack's shoulder. "This would have destroyed any hope Mr. Brent had of respectable employment. Sir Reginald wielded considerable influence in government circles." John Brent had grown ashen as the contents were revealed, though his voice remained steady when he spoke. "The court-martial was for a minor infraction, failure to properly account for supplies during a confused retreat. I was reprimanded and reduced in rank, nothing more, but Sir Reginald chose to interpret it in the worst possible light." Miss Marple watched Hester Pomeroy's face carefully during these revelations. The young woman's composure had cracked completely, tears flowing freely down her cheeks as the full extent of her uncle's cruelty became apparent to everyone present. "He promised me this morning that he had improving news for certain people," Hester whispered, her voice breaking with emotion. "I never imagined he could be so heartlessly vindictive." John had already suffered enough for his mistake. Inspector Slack frowned as he examined the resealed envelope more closely. "Miss Marple, you're suggesting that someone read these letters before Sir Reginald's death? That would require considerable boldness, given the risk of discovery." "Indeed, Inspector. Yet consider the evidence before us. The seal has been carefully opened and resealed with household materials. The timing suggests this occurred sometime during the day, perhaps while Sir Reginald was occupied with other Christmas preparations." Lady Bantry shifted uncomfortably in her chair. "But surely only someone with access to the house could have managed such a thing. It's not the sort of activity one could pursue with others about." Mrs. Forrester looked up from her corner with an expression of dawning understanding. Hester was up very early this morning, arranging flowers and seeing to the final decorative touches. She would have had ample opportunity to search Sir Reginald's study without interruption. The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a snuffed candle. All eyes turned to Hester, who seemed to shrink into herself under the collective gaze of the assembled company. I was concerned about his threats," she admitted in a voice barely above a whisper. "He had been making such ominous comments about John's past, and I feared what he might do. I thought if I could read his correspondence, I might understand how serious his intentions were." Theo Grant, who had been unusually quiet during these revelations, suddenly spoke up with agitation. "Good Lord, Hester, you couldn't have known what those letters contained. Surely the knowledge alone wouldn't have driven you to such extreme measures." But Miss Marple had been studying the young woman's face with a penetrating attention that had solved so many mysteries over the years. What she saw there was not the shock of someone discovering terrible news, but the resigned despair of someone whose worst fears had been confirmed. "You already suspected the contents, didn't you, Miss Pomeroy?" she said gently. "Your uncle had made his intentions clear through his previous actions and statements. The letters merely confirmed what you had already feared would come to pass." Hester nodded miserably. He had been making inquiries about John's military service for weeks. He questioned Dr. Lyle about character references, asked Mrs. Forrester about her opinions on suitable marriages for young women. I knew he was building a case against our engagement. The motive had finally emerged in its full, tragic complexity. This was not a crime born of sudden passion, but the desperate action of a young woman who saw her future happiness being systematically destroyed by a man who valued control more than the well-being of those under his authority. Inspector Slack consulted his notebook with the methodical approach of a man assembling a legal case. So we have motive established through the letters, opportunity demonstrated through Miss Pomeroy's access to the house and her early morning activities, and method proven through the physical evidence we've gathered. But surely, John Brent interjected with desperate hope, others had similar access and opportunity. Mrs. Forrester has been a frequent visitor to this house. Dr. Lyle knows the layout as well as any family member. Even Mr. Grant has been here often enough to be familiar with the electrical arrangements. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. A valid observation, Mr. Brent. Let us consider each possibility systematically. Mrs. Forrester, you mentioned earlier that you had your own grievances against Sir Reginald. Might you elaborate on the nature of your dispute? Mrs. Forrester straightened with dignity, though her voice carried undertones of old pain. Sir Reginald used his influence to quash my son's appeal against a military conviction. My boy died in prison because of that decision, but I was at church throughout the evening service, as half the village can attest. Dr. Lyle, Miss Marple continued, you possess the medical knowledge that might have informed the precise positioning of the trip line, and you certainly understand Sir Reginald's physical limitations well enough to exploit them. Dr. Lyle shook his head firmly. I remained in the drawing room throughout the game, as did most of the company. Besides, I lack the technical skills that this crime required. My hands are trained for medicine, not the delicate wirework we've discovered. And Mr. Grant, your electrical expertise would certainly have been valuable in sabotaging the fuse, and your theatrical background might have provided insight into orchestrating the timing. Theo Grant looked genuinely horrified by the suggestion. Miss Marple, I assure you my knowledge extends only to simple lighting arrangements. The precision we've seen tonight is far beyond my capabilities. Moreover, my stage work has always been concerned with effects, not deception. Miss Marple surveyed the assembled company with the satisfaction of someone whose theoretical framework was being confirmed by systematic elimination. Each suspect possessed certain qualifications for the crime, yet only one had combined all the necessary elements: detailed knowledge of the victim's habits, technical skill with cards and wirework, access to the house's electrical systems, and, most crucially, the desperate motive that could drive someone to such elaborate and calculated revenge. Inspector, she said quietly, I believe we have sufficient evidence to proceed with an arrest. Chapter 10. Evensong. 7 that were won. The fire had burned low in the grate of Ashgrove Hall's drawing room, its dying embers casting flickering shadows that seemed to dance with the ghosts of the evening's terrible revelations. Miss Marple sat in her accustomed chair, her knitting needles moving with their familiar rhythm as she prepared to weave together the final threads of a mystery that had transformed Christmas Day into something far darker than anyone could have imagined. Inspector Slack had taken his position with official gravity, his notebook at the ready to record what would undoubtedly prove to be a confession. The assembled company waited in strained silence, each face bearing the particular expression of those who have witnessed the unmasking of evil disguised as innocence. The crime we have investigated this evening, Miss Marple began in her gentle, measured voice, represents one of the most calculated and elaborate murders it has been my misfortune to encounter. What appeared to be a tragic accident during harmless Christmas entertainment was in reality a carefully orchestrated execution disguised within the framework of a parlour game. She paused to adjust her spectacles, her pale blue eyes taking in each member of the company with the penetrating gaze that had seen through so many deceptions over the years. The beauty of the plan lay in its use of existing circumstances as camouflage. 6 harmless murders during our game established a pattern of scattered movement and theatrical cries in darkness. The 7th round provided perfect cover for genuine homicide, as everyone had been conditioned to accept mysterious sounds and confusion as part of the entertainment. Hester Pomeroy sat frozen in her chair, her face pale as winter moonlight, her hands clasped so tightly that the circulation had been cut off entirely. Beside her, John Brent maintained his protective stance, though his expression had taken on the hollow quality of a man watching his dreams crumble into dust. The technical aspects of the crime demonstrate remarkable forethought and skill, Miss Marple continued. The electrical fuse was bridged with chocolate wrapper foil, a material that would conduct current when the switch was thrown but maintain the circuit interruption when desired. This guaranteed prolonged darkness for the crucial 7th round, far beyond what had occurred in previous games. She lifted the marked playing cards from the side table, displaying them under the lamp's steady illumination. The Ace of Spades and King of Hearts were scratched with hairline precision, allowing the dealer to place them exactly where needed through false cutting and practiced manipulation. Mr. Brent, as the detective, was sent toward the front entrance, while Sir Reginald, finding himself without a designated role, naturally gravitated toward his preferred hunting ground at the rear of the house. Dr. Lisle shifted uncomfortably in his chair. But how could the murderer have been certain that Sir Reginald would take the back stairs at that precise moment? An excellent question, Doctor. The answer lies in understanding Sir Reginald's character and his predictable responses to certain stimuli. He was a man who prided himself on being in control, on catching others in moments of weakness or error. When the lights went out for the final time, someone made a sound, perhaps a deliberately clumsy movement or a whispered word, that drew him toward the back staircase with the eagerness of a hunter pursuing prey. The tripline itself had been positioned with surgical precision, its height calculated using chalk marks that ensured Sir Reginald's ankle would encounter the silk thread at exactly the right angle to produce a catastrophic fall. The black sewing silk, fine as a spider's web but strong as steel cable, had been anchored between the newel post and a twist of holly wire, creating an invisible barrier that would snap under impact and then be quickly removed before the lights returned. The holly wire was cut with embroidery scissors, Miss Marple observed, glancing meaningfully at Hester's reticule, and the severed piece disposed of in the gilt match trough, along with the remaining silk. However, microscopic traces remained caught in the varnish of the newel post, and the characteristic twist of the wirework betrayed the hand of someone trained in millinery or similar precise craft work. Inspector Slack consulted his notes with professional thoroughness. The physical evidence is overwhelming, but we must also consider the question of motive. Miss Pomeroy, the letters found in your uncle's pocket reveal the extent of his intentions regarding your future. Hester's voice, when she finally spoke, was barely audible above the settling sounds of the old house around them. He would have destroyed John completely. Not content merely to forbid our marriage, he intended to ensure that John could never find respectable employment anywhere. It was vindictive cruelty of the worst kind. "You read the letters this morning," Miss Marple stated gently. "The resealed envelope bears evidence of household wax applied over the original seal. You knew exactly what your uncle planned to do, and you resolved to prevent it by any means necessary." The young woman's composure finally cracked completely. Tears flowed freely down her cheeks as the weight of her actions settled upon her with crushing finality. "I never intended for him to die," she whispered. "I thought perhaps a fall might injure him enough to delay his plans, give us time to marry before we could interfere. I never realized how violent the impact would be against those stone floors." John Brent moved protectively closer to his fiancée, his face a mask of anguish. "Hester, why didn't you tell me what he was planning? We could have faced it together, found another way." "What other way was there?" she replied with desperate intensity. "You don't understand the extent of his influence, the connections he maintained throughout the government and military establishments. One word from Sir Reginald Pomeroy could have followed you for the rest of your life." Miss Marple observed this exchange with the compassionate understanding of someone who had witnessed many human tragedies over the years. Love can drive people to extraordinary lengths, both noble and terrible. In this case, a young woman's determination to protect her future led her to commit a crime that required remarkable technical skill and psychological insight. Inspector Slack rose from his chair with the weary authority of duty. "Hester Pomeroy, I am placing you under arrest for the murder of Sir Reginald Pomeroy. You're not obliged to say anything, but anything you do say may be given in evidence." The arrest proceeded with the formal dignity that British law required, though the sight of Hester being led away in handcuffs cast a pall over everyone present that no amount of legal necessity could diminish. John Brent followed at a distance, his face bearing the expression of a man whose world had collapsed around him in the space of a few terrible hours. As the official proceedings concluded, and the last of the evidence was gathered, Miss Marple found herself alone with Lady Bantry in the drawing-room, where the evening's entertainment had begun with such innocent intentions. "7 murders on Christmas Day," Lady Bantry murmured, echoing the sensational headlines that would undoubtedly appear in the morning papers, though only one was real. How dreadfully clever and how very tragic. Miss Marple folded her knitting with careful precision, her movements reflecting the methodical nature of mind that had unravelled such a complex mystery. Games can be dangerous things, my dear Dolly, when people bring genuine malice to what should be harmless entertainment. It is always the small domestic details that reveal the truth. A scratch on a playing card, a twist of wire, a fragment of chocolate foil. Outside, the church bells of St. Mary Mead drifted across the frosty fields, calling the faithful to evensong with their ancient message of peace and redemption. Inside Ashgrove Hall, the remnants of Christmas decoration seemed to mock the tragic events they had witnessed, their festive brightness dimmed by the shadow of murder most carefully planned and coldly executed.